Welcome back, everyone. Dan Vega here, Spring Developer Advocate at VMware. Today, we're going to be talking about writing integration tests using test containers. We'll get into what test containers is in just a second, but let's talk about tests in general. If we're being honest, we all know that tests are important, but we don't write enough of them. Am I right? Or am I right? I don't know about you, but personally, whenever I get some kind of friction between me and writing tests, I end up not writing them. So if I can write a test and it's fast and it's easy to do, and I know the tools that are involved to write tests, I'm going to do it. And that's why I love test containers. It is one of those tools that makes the right thing to do the easy thing to do. And the right thing to do is write tests. The easy thing to do it with is test containers. So let's look at what test containers is, why we might want to include it in our next project, some changes that happen in Spring Boot 3.1 that make this a lot easier to do. And then we'll bring it full circle into a real example here. We're building out a new service here on the channel, and we'll talk about that and how we can include test containers in it. All right, so here we are on testcontainers.com. If you want to go ahead and get some background on what test containers is, it's a great place to start. You can see that it supports many languages. So this isn't just a Java or a Spring thing. It has support for Java, Go, .NET, Node, Python, and so on. So there's, it started with Java though. This is, I think Java is the longest supported library. So if you want to get started with Java, this is a really good place to start. Getting started with test containers for Java. This will give you a really good introduction into it. Also, you'll want to check out the docs. So if you go into the Java docs, that will go ahead and put you in here, give you a quick start. What are the features? The modules are important. Okay, what are we going to use a test container for? Today, we're going to use it for a database. So how do you use that? You can find your database in here. Today, we'll be using PostgreSQL. And then you can use, there are some examples, some requirements, and a whole bunch of information on here. So testcontainers.org, really good place to get started. What are we building today? So in a previous video, we built some of this post service. So I'm building out a JSON-like placeholder service called Danson, and it's really just to like have all these different microservices, and we can introduce gateways and some cloud concepts, but really just a fictitious example, but also serves a real need. Like I want to run a local JSON placeholder service. I could have cloned that repo and run it locally, but that's no fun. I want to build my own thing, right? So we're building out posts. In the previous video, we did some TDD and building out kind of the unit test of the REST controller. We're going to kind of reconstruct this service from scratch because I really want to talk through some of the stuff we're going to cover in the integration side of testing today. Also, I don't want you to have to watch that video to watch this one. So that's why we're going to do that. So we'll go through, we'll create this post service. This post service is going to use Spring Data JDBC. It's going to talk to a PostgreSQL database, and it's going to do that using the Docker Compose module. So we're going to spin up a container of a PostgreSQL database locally without having to set one up. This is great. Everything works until we go to start to write some tests. Now we write our tests and we're not running Docker, right? We're not like spinning up a Docker container to write our tests that way. So how do we do it? And that's where test containers comes in. Again, this used to be it was still easy before 3.1, but there was some extra hoops you had to jump through. I'm going to show you what those were in case you're coming from an older version. It's super simple in Spring Boot 3.1 with test containers. Couldn't be easier to get up and running. And I don't know, I was very surprised the first time I used test containers. I thought like spinning up a container for a test, that sounds slow. I'm not going to do anything if it's slow. It's extremely fast. I love this project and all the people behind it. So I'm excited to walk through that. With that, let's go over to start.spring.io and create a new project. So you can see I filled out some project information about this already. We are going to use Maven, the latest 3.2 version of Spring Boot, which at the time of this recording is milestone 3. Dev.danvega is the group. Posts is the artifact. I'm going to actually cut this off here and just have this as Danson as the package. I'm using Java 21. Feel free to use whatever version of Java you'd like. We're going to build out a web application with Spring Data JDBC, talking to Postgres using the Docker Compose support. So that's it. We're going to go ahead and generate this, download a zip file. I'm going to go ahead and import this into IntelliJ. You go ahead and use whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. And with that, Let's write some code, friends. All right, so we're gonna go through and quickly build out some of this application so that we can start writing some integration tests against it. Now, again, you didn't have to watch previous videos to understand this. I am gonna fly through this pretty quickly though, so this is nothing new. We've done a bunch of this on the channel before. Go ahead and check out some of the previous videos. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna start with resources, and under data, I'm going to have this post.json. This has a list of all the posts. This is basically what JSON placeholder service gives you out of the box. It gives you 100 posts, and we're gonna model our system after this. So I need a post record with an ID, a user ID, a title, and a body. So with that, I'm going to come up here and create a new package. We'll call this post. Inside of post, I'm going to create a new Java record called post. So I'm going to say record. This is going to have an ID, a user ID, a string title, and a string body. Great. Okay, now that we have a record, we're going to need a Spring Data JDBC repository. So let's say post repository. Great. This is going to be an interface that extends the list CRUD repository. The type is post. The ID type is integer. And we are off and running. Next, I'm going to need some way to kind of load some data. So I'm going to create a new class here. I'm going to call this the post data loader. Let's just go with that. This is going to be a component, and this is going to implement the command line runner. We basically want to load some data at runtime. Now, where are we going to load this data? Great question. And if we go ahead and look at the compose.yaml, because we're using the Docker Compose support, we're basically creating a service, a container for Postgres. It is using the Postgres latest image. I want to actually assign a version to this. So I'm going to say 16. What is the database? We'll call this posts. We'll give it a secret of secret and a username of Dan, and I'll go ahead and expose this port 5432. So cool, that's where we're storing the data, but we need a schema file. Oh, we actually already had one. Oh, did we not? Oh, and I went ahead and set one up. So we have a schema here. This is just going to create the table called posts and have these columns ID, user ID, title, body, and version, which reminds me that we are going to need a version for this. This just has to do with Spring Data JDBC. And while we're here, let's go ahead and put these on separate lines, set this up for Spring Data JDBC. So we need an @ID annotation, and we also need an @version. This is just how Spring Data JDBC works when it's trying to figure out, like, am I creating a new one of these things, or am I updating an existing one? So we have that in place. Now we need our post data loader. I'm going to go ahead and paste some code in here. We don't need to go through every single line of this. We've done this before. What I'm doing here is I'm getting the object mapper. I'm getting that post repository. I'm getting those through constructor injection. I'm saying, hey, if the database has 0 records, let's go ahead and read from that post.json. We're going to load that into the database. We're going to do that by getting the resource as a stream. And then we're going to use the object mapper to read that JSON. And what we're going to get back is of type posts. Now I don't have that, so I'm going to go ahead and create that. This is just a simple record called posts. And all this does is represent a list of posts. So I'm going to say post, and that should satisfy that. So if everything was done correctly, we should be able to go ahead and run our application. It's going to see the Docker Compose file, and you actually need Docker running for this to happen. What are you doing, Dan? Let's go ahead and run Docker and then see if we can't get this to work. Let's rerun our application. It sees the Docker Compose file by convention, checks to see if it's already started. It's not, so it creates it, starts it, and everything is up and running. If we go over to our terminal and we do a quick curl-like command, this is using http, which is just like curl, but it's a little bit more readable. And I can just say 8080 / oh, actually, we don't have any endpoints available yet. But I do know that this is working because where are we? We have, no, we have not inserted any data. Did we not? Did we? say loading posts from JSON. Okay, well that is okay. That is because the count was 0. The count was greater than 0 because we used this Docker container before. But if you follow that, you should be able to get some records into a database, which gives us a starting point for, we're getting closer to being able to write an integration test. Let's go ahead and write a controller and then we can do that. All right, next I'm gonna go ahead and create a controller. We're gonna call this post controller. This is going to be a REST controller, respond to requests at /API/posts. And let's just go ahead and paste some info in here and we'll talk through this real quick. We actually don't have a couple things in here. I need to bring in the validation support. So let's go ahead and add that dependency. This is Spring Boot starter validation. That's great. Let's go ahead and refresh this. I want to make sure that, hey, when somebody sends a new post to us, that this is not empty and that this is not empty. All right. So we're validating that. And I also need a post not found exception. So post not found exception. Great. This is going to extend the runtime exception, and this is going to return a response status of not found. Cool. So with those in place, I think we have everything we need. So all we have here, we're bringing in the post repository. This is going to do the database access for us. We have a way to find all of the posts in the database. We can find one by its ID if we don't find it. So if we give it an invalid ID, it will throw a post not found exception. We have a way to save one, and we're validating that you're sending us a correct post. So no empty title, no empty body. We have a way to update an existing one. So send us the ID and the updated post, and we will update the title and the body. And then we have a way to delete one. So let's go ahead and just test this out real quick. I'm going to rerun this application and I'm going to head over to my terminal. And now with that in place, we should be able to hit 8080/API/posts. And we see that we get all of them. I want to get a particular one. I can get one. If I try to get one with a bad ID, then we get not found /API/post/999. Cool. So everything seems to be working. Again, this is kind of backwards from the last video where we did some TDD, but I want to talk and specifically focus on integration tests today. So let's do that. So I'm going to write a couple of integration tests, one for the controller level. So we have some requests that come in and I want to actually spin up a server, make a request to find all, and then verify the results. And we're including the post repository in this test that talks to the database. This is an integration test. We're testing the entire kind of call through the stack here. I also want to do one quick test on the repository. Now, I normally don't write a ton of tests against the repository for all of the things that Spring is already testing. I will write them for custom finders, and even that is kind of iffy. So what I mean by that is if I have, say, I want to return a list, or actually I want to return a post, and I want to find by title. So if I want to find by title, I'll accept a title and that will return a post. So now even in this situation, I may not write a test for it, but I want to just kind of give you an example of how to write a test, because if you have certain ones where you are actually writing custom queries, so come in here and say query, select, these are where I might write some custom, some integration tests for. But I just want to give you an example of how you can write a live test against your repository here that talks to a database, and then an integration test against the controller. So let's start with the repository. All right, so the first thing is I'm back at start.spring.io. I didn't include test containers because I want to talk about what it actually brings in. So let's come back here and go to dependencies, and I'm going to add test containers. And I also think this is a pretty cool example. I come back here often to do this explore command. So control space, I'm going to control space. This will explore what is happening in the project. So now I can go down and look at what dependencies were added here. I can see that the Spring Boot test containers dependency was added. I can also see that test container support for JUnit Jupyter, JUnit 5, and test container support for PostgreSQL was added. So these are the 3 dependencies that I'm going to need to go ahead and add to my project. So I'm going to come back over to my pom.xml. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go ahead and add these. I'm going to refresh this. And now we can begin to write our tests. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a test for the post repository. We're going to call this the post repository test, and we're off and running. All right, so now this is specifically a test against the repository. I could add something like at Spring Boot test, but this brings in the entire application context. This will kind of slow our test down. What I want to do is use a slice test, and there happens to be a slice test for JDBC test. So I'm going to say at data JDBC test, and now this will load just the relevant bits for this. So we're also going to talk about test containers. To get started with test containers, I'm going to add this test containers annotation to our class, and now we can come in and create a container. What is a container? A container is a Docker container in this instance, and there are many different types of containers. You can check out the docs to see how this works, but in this class, in this case, I'm going to use a PostgreSQL container. So I'm going to say PostgreSQL container. And this is going to be, let's just call this Postgres, and this is a new PostgreSQL container. And then you have to provide a Docker image name, similar to the Docker Compose file. I want to use exactly what I'm using in production, in dev, and so I'm going to say this is Postgres 16.0, and that should give me what I need. Now I'm going to do one more thing here, and I'm going to add the static keyword. This just means I'll reuse this container between tests instead of firing up a new one. So that is what I need for this. Now I can go ahead and bring in the post repository. So I'm going to say, hey, give me that post repository. We'll call this the post repository. And then I think that's really all we need. Now, before Spring Boot 3.1, we had to add a little bit of extra boilerplate to make this happen. And why was that? So we needed to come in and we needed to say dynamic property source, and we would have to say something like static void data source properties. We would have a dynamic properties registry. We call this registry, and then we would come in here and say registry.add, and then we'd have to add things like the Spring data source.url and then pass it a value. No longer do we need to do this. This is kind of boilerplate code that we no longer need to do, and this is all thanks to the connection details interface and the things we added in Spring Boot 3.1. I've covered this as far as the Docker Compose support goes, but here in test containers, we can get rid of all of that by just adding the @service connection. Now, this is basically going to tell Spring, hey, Spring Boot, please go ahead and configure yourself. So that gives us what we need to get going. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to I actually just want to see if this loads. I want to make sure that the Postgres container is running. So I'm going to write a test for that. So I'm going to say test void connection established. And inside of there, we're going to assert that Postgres is created. And we want to make sure that it is, I got to import that. I got to import that from assert j and say is true. So we want to make sure that's working. And I'll just do one more to say, hey, is the Postgres running? So let's say, is it running? And is that true? Cool. So that gives us enough to get going. Now I can go ahead and run this test and see if anything is working. There is going to be a problem here, but we'll talk through it in a second. All right, so there's a couple errors here. Error creating bean. I always like to come down here and we're going to look at this error, and it's going to start here and say, hey, failed to replace data source with an embedded database for tests. If you want an embedded database, please put a supported one on the class path, like H2. So this is what I would have done in the past. I would have included something like H2. We'd use an H2 database for our tests, our Postgres database for our dev and production. And now we're at a pass, right? Like we are not using something that we're using in production. So we're not going to catch a lot of those errors that we could catch locally until we got to like a test or even, or even a production level. So this is why I like to use whatever we're using in production as even in my test environment. So what we want to do is we want to use this test database that is getting spin up for us. How do we do that? Well, we can just come in here and say, hey, that auto configure test database, the thing that you're doing, you're trying to configure one for us. Don't do that. I have one for you. So I'm going to say auto configure, replace none. And now if we go ahead and spin this up, let's try and rerun this again. And everything seems to be working. So now we're using a container. So this is a throwaway container. Now this is important. All of the things that are happening on the dev side, the 100 posts that we load into the dev database, that's not happening here. We are using a separate container for this, for our tests. And this is good. This is not a bad thing because we don't want to pollute the data that's going on in our dev environment. These are just going to be for our tests. So we'll need some setup. We'll need to go ahead and do some setup here. So I'm going to say, let's say before each. So let's do a setup method and let's go ahead and create some posts. So I'm going to say list.of. We'll say new post. I'll say one. We'll say hello world. This is my first post. We'll say null for the version. And for right now, one post is fine. We'll just say posts. And then we'll go ahead and save these. So now I'm going to use the post repository. I'm going to ahead persist this. So I'm going to say save all. If we want to add some more later, we can. I'm going to say posts. And now I can write a test to make sure that we have some data in the database in the form of my title. So again, I'm not going to write tests for all of the generic stuff that we get out of the box, the find all, the find by one. I'm not going to do that. That will happen in my integration test of the controller all the way through to the database. For this, I just want to kind of focus on any custom repository methods I have. So in this case, we're going to check out that title one. So I'm going to say test void should return post by title. So we'll say the, actually, let's just do this. We won't even, so now I'm going to say post is equal to post repository dot find by title. Let's pass in a title. So hello world, that should match that. And then we're going to go ahead and get our post back, and we're going to assert that post is not null. That should be good enough for this. Let's go ahead and run this. This will tell me that the before each runs, it actually persists it off to the database, and then it is there. So something's going wrong. Failed to execute insert. We are trying to insert one with version 0. Did we not provide? Post does not exist. Okay, so that's telling us that in our application.properties, we did not say SQL.init mode equals always, so that table is not there. Let's go ahead and try and run that again. And great, so that is working and everything is done here in our repository test. I just wanted to show you an example of this, and now we can move on to our integration test. All right, so now I want to write an integration test for this controller. I'm going to go create test, post controller test. We're going to come in here, and because this is an integration test, we're going to say this is a Spring Boot test. It's going to load the entire application context, but we also want to say, hey, on the web environment side, I want a random port. So we're going to actually spin up a Tomcat embedded server here. This is going to run, and we're going to also need test containers. So I'm going to say test containers here. This test containers annotation just says, hey, go ahead and scan this class for container annotations. So we're going to add a container application annotation the same way that we did in the last one. In fact, let's go back over to that particular one and our post repository test, and we can copy this same line to here. Cool, so now we have a connection to a PostgreSQL container. Now, what happens is we're gonna write some tests to the HTTP controller. So let's go ahead and close this. I like to have my test over here and my actual class, my system under test over here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna spin up a web server. We're gonna actually call the /API/posts, which is going to invoke this method, and then return a list of posts. Now, what posts are they going to return? In this case, there should actually be 100 in the database because this component is going to get picked up. So our post data loader is going to say, oh, I don't have any records in that database that you just span up. I'm going to go ahead and run this insert. So in this case, we should have 100. So let's go ahead and check that. Now, how are we going to check that? Let's start with our tests. So test void should find post when, actually should find all posts, right? So what we need to do now is call /API/here, let's do this, /API/posts. So I'm in a Spring Boot 3.2 application. We've talked about the new REST client. I love the new REST client. I wish I could use the new REST client here, but I can't. Again, we're still in a milestone phase. There is an issue out there. I'll link to that in the description below if you want to read through it. But I wish I had a test REST client here that I can use to make a call to my API. Instead, we are either going to need to use the test REST template or the web client test. In this case, I'm in a blocking application, so I'm just going to reach for the test REST template. I'll go ahead and update this code later if we're using the REST client. So I'm going to say REST template. So now I have an instance of this. I can make an API call to this over here. How do we do that? We're going to say REST template, and we're going to say get for object. In this case, I want to go call /API/posts, and what I'm going to get back is an array of posts. So that should work. Let's say var posts, right? Now what we can do is we can say assert that. What do we want to assert here? We want to say posts.length is equal to, is that right? Posts. Are we having the same problem we had before? Yes, we are. Static method. There we go. Is equal to, and again, this should be 100 now. So let's go ahead and run this. All right, that worked. That means our container spun up. We can go ahead and look through the logs here. Our container spun up using test containers. Again, that was pretty fast. Do we have some logging in here? Thought I would see some logging. There we go. Loading posts in the database using that JSON. So it's loading the posts into our test container database. And now we have 100. So cool. So that worked. Let's go ahead and try to find one by an ID. So I'm going to say at test void should find post when valid, right? Valid post ID. This is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to use the REST template exchange method because I want to go ahead and assert on the status code as well. So I'm going to say to /API/post/1. This is going to be a GET request. I don't need an entity. I don't need a request entity there. And then what is the response type going to be? Let's just see. This is hard to see here. This is going to be a post. And let's go ahead and say that. Response. Okay, so now that I have the response, I can say, let's assert that the response dot get status code is equal to, now we're not just checking the number, so we're not just saying, hey, is it a 200? We're going to compare it to the HTTP status dot OK. Okay. All right. So that's that. And then I also want to check, hey, let's see, assert that the response dot get body is not null. We should have something coming back. All right. So let's go ahead and check that. Awesome. So that's working as well. What I'm going to do now is just kind of throw a whole bunch more tests in here and see if we can just take a look at them, and then we'll run them and make sure everything's working okay. So I'm also going to, I had some questions about this. I marked this as transactional just so that we can go ahead and roll back tests, because if I insert one, I don't want it to like stay in the database, because in this case, I'm looking for a particular number. Again, you could easily get the count and then check it against the count plus one. But this is what I'm doing here. So I want to make sure I can create a post. So I create a new post. I send a test off to that, a test REST API endpoint call to that. Then I just assert that everything that comes back is what I expected. I should be able to not create a post when validation fails. So that's good. Here's the rollback. Hey, I want to roll back when we update one, or I want to roll back when I delete one. Let's just see if we can go ahead and run these tests. And again, I'm just trying to cut down on time here before this gets way too long. Cool. So almost everything works. But what did we do? Expect 100, actual 101. Yeah, because we inserted one, right? So if we insert one, should find create new post when post is valid. Should create new post when validation fails. So I wonder if that's failing. This is rolling back. So somewhere we're inserting a new one. So there's only two places that should happen, right? So this should say bad request, which it is. So it should not be inserting one. Rollback when post is valid. When post is invalid, roll back. Somewhere we are inserting a new one. I wonder if that's just because now there's 101 in there. Let's just see if that goes. Cool. All right. So yeah, that's it. Mainly what I wanted to walk through was the test container support, how it is so much easier in Spring Boot 3.1. I'll even link to a blog post below by a coworker, Moritz Hallebritter. This is a really good blog post that walks through all the new features in 3.1 as far as test containers goes. And again, it just makes it so much easier. I can use that at container annotation, the at service connection. I declare my container and I can go ahead and use it. This makes integration testing easy. The response time is fast for me. And again, make the right thing to do, the easy thing to do. This is the easy thing to do for me now. And I'm testing closer to production. I'm using the same database that we're using in production. This makes me happy. So, hey, I hope you learned something new, friends. If you did, do me a favor, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. And as always, happy coding, friends.